What did ancient humans do with people who heard voices? Imagine you're walking home one evening and a voice speaks to you, clear as a friend standing beside you, except no one's there. Here's the thing, statistically, this has probably already happened to someone you know. Maybe even you, in that half-asleep moment right before your alarm goes off, when your brain swears it heard your name. Most of us shrug it off and blame the pillow, but for most of human history, that voice wasn't a glitch to be ignored. It was a message. And depending on when and where you were born, hearing it could make you a criminal, a patient, a witch, or a king's most trusted advisor. So what actually happened to the people who heard voices before we had a word like schizophrenia to file it under? The answer is stranger, older, and honestly more complicated than you'd expect. Let's start at the very beginning, because the beginning might not be where you think it is.
The voice that built civilization.
Here's a theory that sounds like science fiction but was published in a serious academic press. Psychologist Julian Jaynes argued in 1976 that ancient humans didn't experience consciousness the way we do at all. He called it the bicameral mind, a theory that the two hemispheres of the ancient brain functioned almost like two separate people. One side gave instructions. The other side heard them as an external authoritative voice, often interpreted as a god speaking directly to you. Jaynes pointed to something odd in the oldest texts we have. In the Iliad, Homer's characters don't seem to make decisions the way we do. They don't sit and deliberate. A god speaks and they act. Achilles doesn't decide to spare Agamemnon. Athena grabs him by the hair and tells him to stand down, and he does without so much as a second thought about whether the voice was real. Jaynes's theory is controversial. Most modern neuroscientists don't think the ancient brain was structurally different from ours. But here's the strange part. The pattern he noticed in the literature is real. Across dozens of ancient cultures, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, early Hebrew, Greek, leaders, prophets, and ordinary people describe divine voices instructing them, and nobody treats it as unusual. It's just how decisions got made. So before we ask how ancient people treated voice hearers, we might need to ask a stranger question first. Was hearing voices ever considered abnormal at all? Turns out sometimes yes, sometimes very much no. And the difference often came down to one thing: whether the voice was useful. Korkorkol got a job title. Now here's where it gets strange. At Delphi, in ancient Greece, there was a woman called the Pythia. For roughly 1,000 years, the Greeks, and later the Romans, believed she could channel the god Apollo and answer questions no living person could answer. Kings, generals, and ordinary citizens climbed the mountain to ask her things. Should we go to war? Should I marry this man? What does the future hold? She'd sit above a chasm in the rock, breathe in vapors rising from below, and start speaking, often in fragmented trance-like phrases that priests would then interpret into verse. Modern geologists have actually found evidence of ethylene gas seeping from a geological fault beneath the temple, a substance known to produce mild euphoric dissociative states, so there may be a real chemical explanation for what she experienced. But notice what the ancient Greeks did with a woman who spoke in someone else's voice seemingly outside her own control. They didn't lock her away. They built her a temple. They gave her a permanent position of enormous political influence, one that lasted centuries and shaped decisions across the entire Mediterranean world. Same basic experience, external voice, loss of ordinary control, completely different outcome than what would happen to that same woman 1,000 years later in a European village. So what changed? But wait, what about the Ons? Who got burned? This is the part people usually assume when they picture how the past treated voice hearers. And it's not wrong, it's just late. Very late, historically speaking. By the medieval and early modern period in Europe, the frame had shifted hard. A voice that couldn't be tied to an approved religious institution wasn't divine anymore, it was suspect. The 1487 Witch Hunting Manual, the Malleus Maleficarum, treated unexplained voices and visions as potential evidence of demonic influence, something to be investigated, confessed, and in the worst cases punished. Joan of Arc is probably history's most famous example, and her story shows both sides of this coin in one lifetime. As a teenager, she said she heard the voices of Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, instructing her to support Charles VII and drive the English out of France. For a while, that voice made her a military leader who turned the tide of the 100 Years' War. The same voice, reinterpreted by a hostile political tribunal a few years later, got her tried for heresy and burned at the stake in 1431. At 19 years old, same voices, same woman. Two completely different verdicts, decided entirely by who was doing the judging and what they needed to be true. That's the pattern worth sitting with. It wasn't really about the voice at all. It was about who got to decide what the voice meant, but even in Europe, the burn the witch era wasn't the whole story. And it definitely wasn't universal. Go almost anywhere else on the planet during roughly the same centuries, and you find a completely different relationship with the exact same experience. Now here's the part nobody talks about. In dozens of cultures across Siberia, the Americas, Africa, and Southeast Asia, hearing voices wasn't treated as an illness to cure or a crime to punish. It was treated as a job interview. Anthropologist Mircea Eliade documented what's often called the shamanic initiation crisis across cultures with no contact with one another, a striking independently repeated pattern. A young person starts hearing voices, seeing visions, sometimes has seizures or periods of apparent madness. Instead of restraining them, the community's existing shamans step in and essentially say, "This is not breaking. This is becoming." The person is guided through the experience rather than sedated out of it. They're taught to interpret the voices, work with them, and eventually use that sensitivity to serve the community. As a healer, a diviner, a keeper of ancestral knowledge. The exact same raw experience that might get someone institutionalized in 20th century London could, in a Siberian Evenki or a Yakama community, mark them as spiritually gifted and destined for one of the most respected roles a person could hold. This isn't romanticizing hardship, either. The initiation crisis was often genuinely terrifying for the person going through it. But the community had a container for it. A role. A set of elders who'd been through something similar and could credibly, "I know what this is, and you're going to be okay." Which raises an uncomfortable question for the modern viewer. What happens to a person's experience of hearing voices when there's no container waiting for them at all? But here's where modern science actually catches up. You'd think this is all ancient history, quaint stuff from before we understood the brain. Except one of the most cited pieces of research on this exact question came out in 2015 from a Stanford anthropologist named Tanya Luhrmann. Luhrmann and her team interviewed people diagnosed with schizophrenia who heard voices in 3 different places: the United States, Ghana, and India. Same diagnostic criteria, same basic auditory experience, wildly different reported relationships with the voices. American participants overwhelmingly described their voices as violent, intrusive, and evidence that something was broken in their own mind. The voices told them to hurt themselves, called them worthless, felt like an attack from within. Participants in Ghana and India were far more likely to describe their voices as playful or as relatives, or even as something like spirits offering guidance. Not always pleasant, but not automatically framed as a symptom of a broken self. Same clinical presentation. Radically different lived experience. And the leading explanation isn't biology, it's culture. In places where a cultural framework exists for voices as meaningful rather than purely pathological, people appear to suffer less from the exact same underlying experience. That's not a fringe claim from an outsider, by the way. It's published research from a Stanford professor, built on a methodology psychiatrists take seriously. It suggests something genuinely strange. The culture surrounding a voice hearer may shape how much that voice actually hurts them. So maybe the ancient world wasn't just superstitious about this. Maybe some of them stumbled onto something we're only now relearning through peer review. But what about when it really was treated as illness? Now, to be fair to history, ancient people weren't uniformly mystical about this either. Some of the very earliest surviving medical texts already treat voice hearing and disordered thought as a physical treatable condition, not a spiritual gift at all. The Greek physician Hippocrates, around 400 BCE, argued that what we'd now call psychotic symptoms came from an imbalance in the body's fluids, the 4 humors, not from gods or demons. It sounds primitive to us now, but at the time it was a radical, almost secular idea. Madness has a bodily cause, not a supernatural one, and should be treated by a physician, not a priest. And there's older, stranger evidence too. Archaeologists have found Neolithic skulls, some over 7,000 years old, with holes deliberately carved into them, a practice called trepanning. Many of these patients survived the procedure, based on evidence of bone healing around the wound. Nobody knows for certain why ancient people performed trepanning, but one leading theory is that it was meant to release something. Evil spirits, pressure, whatever was believed to be causing severe mental disturbance, possibly including voice hearing. So even in prehistory, there wasn't one single ancient attitude. There was a genuine tension. Sometimes the voice was a gift, sometimes it was an illness to be physically operated on, sometimes it was a threat to be punished. Ancient humans were arguing about this exact question thousands of years before we had the word psychiatry, which tells you something important. This was never a solved problem we're now more enlightened about. It was always a genuinely hard question, and in some ways we still haven't answered it. The part that sounds like a clip, a voice that fits the myth becomes prophecy. A voice that fits no myth becomes madness. A voice that serves the community becomes a calling. A voice that threatens the community becomes a crime. It was never really about the voice. It was always about who was listening, and what they needed it to mean. That's the thread running through every era we've covered. Delphi, Joan of Arc, Siberian shamans, Stanford's modern research. The voice itself barely changed across 3,000 years of human history. What changed again and again was the room around the person hearing it. Asterisk, what happened when we stopped having a room at all by the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe and North America? Something worse than persecution had emerged in a lot of places. Indifference, dressed up as institutionalization. Places like London's Bethlem Royal Hospital, whose name eventually got shortened into the word Bedlam, became notorious for warehousing people who heard voices or displayed other symptoms of severe mental illness, often in horrific conditions, sometimes even as a form of public spectacle where paying visitors could come and watch the patients. There was no shamanic role waiting for these people, no oracle's temple, no physician offering humor theory, just confinement, and a slowly hardening cultural consensus that a voice with no earthly source meant a mind that had failed. It wasn't until 1911 that the psychiatrist Eugen Bleuler coined the term schizophrenia, literally split mind, to describe this cluster of experiences as a specific medical condition. And it wasn't until decades later that treatment shifted meaningfully away from mere confinement toward anything resembling therapeutic care. Which brings us to something happening right now in your lifetime that echoes those ancient shamanic communities more than you'd expect. But here's the twist. We're Kirklank. In 1987, a Dutch psychiatrist named Marius Rahm did something unusual. One of his patients, a woman named Patsy Hage, told him she heard voices and asked him a question psychiatry hadn't really been built to answer. Instead of just asking how to make the voices stop, could they explore what the voices meant to her? That conversation eventually helped spark what's now called the Hearing Voices movement, a global network, active in dozens of countries today, built on a strikingly ancient premise. Voice hearing isn't automatically a symptom to be silenced. For some people, it can be explored, understood, even lived alongside, with support groups where voice hearers talk openly about their experiences instead of hiding them out of shame. It's not a rejection of modern psychiatry. For many people, medication and clinical treatment remain essential and genuinely life-saving. But the movement added something that had gone missing for a couple of centuries: a room, a community. People who've heard voices themselves, sitting across from you, saying credibly, "I know what this is," sound familiar? It's not identical to a Siberian shaman's initiation or a Delphic temple, but it rhymes. After roughly 200 years of treating the voice as pure malfunction, some corners of modern mental health are quietly rediscovering something ancient humans across dozens of unconnected cultures already seem to know: that meaning and community change how much a voice actually costs the person carrying it. Asterisk, full circle, so picture that same moment again. You walking home, a voice speaking your name with no one there to say it. Now you know what that moment could have meant, depending on nothing about the voice itself, and everything about when and where you happen to be standing. In one century, you're a criminal. In another, an oracle. In one village, broken. In another, chosen. The voice never changes. The room around it always does. Maybe the real question was never, what's wrong with the people who hear voices? Maybe it was always, what kind of room are we willing to build for them?